In the sun-baked town of Copper Springs, 1885, a story of love and redemption is about to unfold. Sarah Matthews arrives with nothing but hope in her heart and a letter promising marriage. But the frontier is as cruel as it is beautiful. The moment she steps off the dusty stagecoach, whispers and judgmental glances cut deeper than any knife. Her would-be suitor takes one look at her size and publicly declares her unmarriageable, leaving her stranded in a town where appearances seem to matter more than character. Just when all seems lost, fate intervenes in the form of James Cooper, the wealthiest rancher in the territory. He sees something in Sarah that others have missed, a strength that could tame more than just wild horses. But can love truly conquer the prejudices of an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound journal lay open on Sarah Matthews' lap as the train rattled westward through the endless prairie. Her careful penmanship filled page after page with dreams too precious to speak aloud. 3 weeks ago, she had stood in her modest Boston apartment, holding the advertisement that would change her life: seeking bride, successful merchant in Copper Springs territory. Life in Boston had grown unbearable after her parents' passing. The whispers followed her everywhere. At church socials, in the marketplace, even at her position as a school teacher. Such a shame, they would say, not bothering to lower their voices. If only she wasn't so substantial. She has such a lovely face. Each comment chipped away at her resolve until she could barely meet her own eyes in the mirror. The letter from Thomas Gardner had seemed like providence. A successful merchant in a frontier town, he wrote of wanting an educated wife who could help manage his business. Their correspondence over 3 months revealed a man who appeared thoughtful and kind. His letters spoke of building a life together, of children's laughter filling a home, of shared dreams under western skies. Sarah traced her fingers over his last letter, memorizing every word. "My dearest Sarah, your intelligence and grace shine through in every letter. I eagerly await your arrival." She had read it so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. Each time she ignored the voice in her heart that whispered, "But you never sent him your photograph." The countryside flying past her window bore little resemblance to the cobblestone streets of Boston. Gone were the familiar spires of churches and the comforting bustle of city life. In their place stretched an endless canvas of wild grass and open sky that both terrified and thrilled her. This was a land of new beginnings, where the past could be left behind like the eastern horizon. Her fellow passengers had changed with the landscape. Gone were the fine ladies in their bustles and gentlemen in their suits, replaced by rugged farmers, weather-beaten traders, and families with hope burning in their eyes. Sarah watched them all, collecting their stories in her journal. The young mother with 3 small children heading to join her husband in Oregon. The elderly couple starting fresh after losing their farm in Ohio. The handsome young man who kept stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. That last one had given her pause. Back home, men never looked at her that way, with genuine interest rather than polite dismissal. Perhaps things truly would be different in the West. She opened her journal to a fresh page and began to write, "Dear Mama and Papa, I wish you could see the person I'm becoming. Each mile puts distance between me and the shy, uncertain girl you knew. The Sarah Matthews who boards this train isn't the same one who will step off it. I'm learning that perhaps I've been measuring myself by the wrong yardstick all along." The porter's call of Junction City, 20-minute stop, sent a ripple of activity through the car. Sarah tucked her journal away and smoothed her travel dress. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she drew out her pocket mirror. The face that looked back at her was flushed with excitement, her dark curls escaping their pins after hours of travel. Her mother would have clicked her tongue at such dishevelment, but Sarah found She rather liked this wind-blown, adventurous version of herself. She had packed carefully for her new life. 2 sturdy work dresses, her best Sunday dress, practical. Boots and the family Bible lay carefully wrapped in her trunk. But her most precious cargo was tucked into her carpet bag, the letters from Thomas, her journal, and her mother's silver locket containing miniature portraits of her parents. These weren't just possessions, they were anchors to who she was, and reminders of who she hoped to become. The young man from earlier caught her eye again as he helped an elderly passenger with her bags. He tipped his hat, and Sarah found herself smiling back before she could think better of it. The interaction left her feeling bold, almost reckless. This was who she could be in the West, someone who smiled at strangers, who took up space, unapologetically, who measured her worth by the size of her heart rather than the size of her dress. As the train lurched back into motion, Sarah pulled out Thomas's letters once more. She had memorized every word, but now she read between the lines with fresh eyes. What would he see when she stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Springs? Would he recognize the woman who had poured her heart into those letters? Or would his eyes see only what so many others had, a woman who didn't fit the narrow confines of society's expectations? The sun was setting now, painting the prairie in shades of gold and purple. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching her reflection fade into the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring Copper Springs, Thomas Gardner, and whatever fate awaited her there. But tonight, somewhere between who she had been and who she would become, Sarah Matthews was simply herself. A woman brave enough to chase her dreams across a continent. She opened her journal one last time, making what would be her final entry of the journey. Whatever happens tomorrow, I choose to believe that somewhere between Boston and Copper Springs, I've found something worth more than any marriage proposal. I've found myself. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of Copper Springs General Store, kicking up clouds of red dust that caught the late afternoon sun. Sarah gripped her carpet bag tighter, heart thundering against her ribs. Through the coach's grimy window, she could make out the town's notice board, its weathered surface plastered with wanted posters, advertisements, and announcements of upcoming socials. "Copper Springs," the driver called out, his voice rough as trail gravel. "End of the line." Sarah waited until the other passengers had descended before gathering her courage. The steps creaked under her weight as she made her way down, conscious of every eye turning toward her. The town stretched out before her, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, their weather-beaten signs announcing the essential businesses of frontier life. General store, assay office, saloon, hotel. "Miss Matthews?" A thin man in a shopkeeper's apron approached, wiping his hands on his cloth. His voice carried across the street, drawing more onlookers. "Thomas Gardner's intended?" "Yes, that's right." Sarah smiled, trying to still the trembling in her hands. "Mr. Gardner is expecting me." The man's face underwent a remarkable transformation. His polite inquiry twisted into something closer to horror, then settled into barely concealed distaste. I see. Well, I'll fetch Thomas straight away. He's, been anticipating your arrival." The whispers started before he'd taken 3 steps. They drifted across the street like tumbleweeds, sharp and stinging. "That's the mail-order bride. Poor Thomas. Did she eat the last one?" Sarah felt each word like a physical blow, but held her head high. She'd weathered worse in Boston, yet something about the openness of the frontier made the cruelty feel more exposed, more raw. The crowd parting drew her attention. Thomas Gardner emerged from his store, and Sarah's heart sank. Gone was any trace of the thoughtful, kind man from the letters. His face was red with embarrassment and barely suppressed anger. "There must be some mistake," he announced loudly, not even bothering to address her directly. "This cannot be the same woman who wrote those letters. I was led to believe." He turned to Sarah now, his voice cutting. "You deliberately deceived me, madam. I requested a suitable wife, not a what, Mr. Gardner?" Sarah's voice emerged stronger than she felt, years of schoolteacher authority lending its steel. "Not a woman who can read and write? Not someone capable of helping manage your business? Or simply not someone who meets your precise specifications for physical beauty?" A titter ran through the gathering crowd. Thomas Gardner's face grew even redder. "I won't be made a fool of. The position of Mrs. Gardner requires someone of appropriate proportions, someone who won't be an embarrassment to my business. Good day, madam." He turned on his heel and stormed back into his store, leaving Sarah standing alone in the street. The crowd began to disperse, some looking away in shame, others openly smirking. Sarah remained rooted to the spot, her carpetbag hanging limply from numb fingers. "Come with me, dear." A gentle voice cut through her shock. An elderly woman in widow's black had appeared at her elbow. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. I help keep the church clean, and we have a small room where you can rest and collect yourself." Sarah allowed herself to be led away from the scene of her humiliation. The church was cool and dark, smelling of beeswax and old hymnals. Mrs. Henderson guided her to a small back room furnished with a narrow bed and a washstand. "Don't you worry about Thomas Gardner," Mrs. Henderson said, pouring water into the basin. "The man's a fool who wouldn't know true worth if it danced a jig on his counter. Rest here as long as you need. We'll figure something out." Left alone, Sarah finally allowed her tears to fall. She wept not just for today's humiliation, but for every slight, every whisper, every sideways glance she'd endured. When the tears ran dry, she went to the washstand and stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror. The woman who looked back at her was flushed but unbowed. She thought of her journal entry from the train. "I found myself. Well, now was the time to prove it." She would not let Thomas Gardner or anyone else in this dust-blown town decide her worth. As the sun set, Sarah unpacked her few belongings. The church room was sparse but clean, with a small window that looked out over the town cemetery, a fitting view, she thought with grim humor, for the death of one dream. But as she watched the last light paint the headstones gold, she remembered something her father used to say: "The good Lord never closes a door without opening a window." She took out her journal and began to write by candlelight. "Dear Mama and Papa, today was not the arrival I hoped for, but I refuse to believe that my journey ends here. Copper Springs may not want Thomas Gardner's wife, but perhaps it needs Sarah Matthews, exactly as she is." The candle burned low as she wrote, casting strange shadows on the walls. Outside, the town settled into its nighttime rhythm. Piano music from the saloon, the distant lowing of cattle, boots on wooden sidewalks. This was not the welcome she had dreamed of, but it was the beginning she had been given. Tomorrow would be soon enough to figure out what came next. For now, in this small room with its narrow bed and view of the dead, Sarah Matthews made herself a promise. She would not run back to Boston with her tail between her legs. She would not shrink herself to fit anyone else's expectations. She would stay, and she would show this town what they had been too blind to see. James Cooper's arrival in Copper Springs never failed to turn heads. Even after 15 years, the sight of him riding down Main Street on his black stallion commanded attention. The deed to the largest ranch in the territory brought respect. But it was more than that. James carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove and no one to impress. Today, he noticed something different in the town's usual buzz. Fragments of conversation drifted up as he dismounted in front of the general store. Mail-order bride, Gardner's shocking behavior, still at the church. He pushed open the store's door, the bell's cheerful jingle at odds, with Thomas Gardner's sour expression behind the counter. "Morning, Thomas. I'll need the usual supplies." "Of course, Mr. Cooper." Gardner's tone was overly bright, clearly eager to share the morning's gossip. Though I must say, you've missed quite the spectacle. This woman arrived claiming to be my mail-order bride, but you wouldn't believe. I don't recall asking. For town gossip with my supplies. James cut him off, his voice level but firm. The deed to Cooper Ranch lay in his breast pocket, a reminder of the power he held in this territory. Every building on this street stood on land he'd sold to the town, a fact that made his disapproval carry weight. Gardner's face reddened as he hurried to gather James's order. While he waited, James studied the store's new notice board. Among the usual advertisements for ranch hands and laundresses, one caught his eye. Experienced teacher seeks position, inquire at church. The bell jingled again as Mrs. Henderson entered, her widow's black, a stark contrast to the dusty street beyond. Her eyes lit up at the sight of James. "Oh, Mr. Cooper, just the man I was hoping to see. You wouldn't happen to need any help up at that big house of yours, would you?" James raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Henderson had never shown interest in domestic positions before. "Something on your mind, ma'am?" She glanced at Gardner, then lowered her voice. "We have a young lady staying at the church, educated from Boston. Good with figures and letters. More importantly, she has a strength about her. That reminds me of your late mother." The comparison caught James's attention. His mother had been the backbone of Cooper Ranch in its early days, helping his father transform a wild piece of territory into the most successful operation for 100 miles. She'd never cared what anyone thought of her methods or her appearance, focusing instead on getting the job done. "She can come by the ranch tomorrow morning if she's interested," James found himself saying. "I could use someone to help with the books and correspondence." Mrs. Henderson's face broke into a knowing smile. "I'll let her know. And James, leave your prejudices at the door when you meet her. She's had enough of those to last a lifetime." Later that afternoon, curiosity got the better of him. He made his way to the church, ostensibly to discuss the position with Reverend Mills. The sound of a clear, strong voice reading aloud drew him to the small garden behind the building. There, he saw her for the first time. Sarah Matthews sat on a weathered bench, reading to a group of transfixed children. Her size was what Gardner had made such a fuss about, James realized, but all he saw was the animation in her face as she brought the story to life, the gentle way she helped a small boy sound out a difficult word, the quiet dignity she carried despite everything the town had thrown at her. One of the children spotted him and waved. "Mr. Cooper, have you come to hear the story too?" Sarah looked up, and James felt the full force of her direct gaze. No shrinking violet here, despite what she'd endured. She closed the book and stood, smoothing her skirts with practiced grace. "Mr. Cooper, I've heard much about you." Her voice carried the refinement of her Boston upbringing, but there was steel beneath the polish. "All good things, I hope." He stepped into the garden, noticing how the children didn't shy away from her as they did from most adults. They clustered around her skirts like chicks around a mother hen, comfortable and secure in her presence. "That would depend on who's doing the telling, I suppose." A hint of humor lifted the corner of her mouth. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned a position at your ranch?" "Yes. Bookkeeping, correspondence, general management of household accounts." He found himself adding, "It would include room and board in the main house, private quarters, of course." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him. "And you're not concerned about how it might look, hiring the woman Thomas Gardner rejected?" "Miss Matthews, I learned long ago that other people's opinions make poor foundation stones for building a life." He met her gaze steadily. "I care about competence, character, and work ethic. Everything else is just noise." Something shifted in her expression, not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of hope. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll send a wagon for your things." He tipped his hat to her and the children. "Good day, Miss Matthews." Children. As he rode back to the ranch that evening, James found his thoughts returning to Sarah Matthews. There was something about her that didn't fit the typical mail-order bride mold. She had fire in her, banked but burning steady, the kind of fire that could either warm a home or burn it down, depending on how it was tended. The ranch house loomed ahead, grand but empty. His mother would have known what to make of Sarah Matthews. "Judge people by how they handle adversity," she used to say. "Anyone can be gracious in success." By that measure, Sarah Matthews had shown more grace in humiliation than Thomas Gardner had in prosperity. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But for the first time in years, James Cooper felt a spark of genuine interest in what the new day might hold. Dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when the wagon arrived at the church. Sarah stood ready, her few possessions packed and her resolve firmly in place. The driver, an elderly ranch hand named Pete, helped her load her trunk without comment or condescension, a small kindness that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "You'll do fine, dear," Mrs. Henderson whispered as they said their goodbyes. "James Cooper's a fair man. Hard sometimes, but fair." The journey to Cooper Ranch revealed why it was the talk of the territory. The property seemed endless, stretching toward the distant mountains like a kingdom unto itself. Herds of cattle dotted the grasslands, and Sarah caught glimpses of wild horses running free in the distance. As they crested a final hill, the ranch house came into view. "Good Lord," Sarah breathed. The house was more mansion than ranch home, a testament to Cooper's success and ambition. 2 stories of solid construction, with a wraparound porch and large windows that caught the morning light. A help-wanted notice had brought her here, but this was no mere domestic position. Pete pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Mr. Cooper's in his study. Through the front door, up the stairs, first door on the right. He likes punctuality." Sarah smoothed her dress, her second best, saved for important occasions, and climbed the porch steps. Each board was swept clean, the windows gleaming. Someone took pride in this home's appearance. The heavy front door swung open at her knock. "Come in, Miss Matthews." James Cooper's voice carried from above. She followed it up the stairs, taking in the tasteful furnishings that spoke of wealth tempered by practical sensibilities. The study door stood open. Cooper sat behind a massive desk, but rose as she entered. The morning light cast his features in sharp relief, a strong jaw, eyes that missed nothing, and shoulders that spoke of actual ranch work rather than mere ownership. "I trust you found everything in order with your transportation?" "Yes, Mr. Cooper. Thank you." Sarah met his gaze directly, refusing to shrink herself. "I'm eager to begin my duties." He gestured to a chair, then lifted a ledger from his desk. "Our previous bookkeeper left things in something of a state. I'd like to see how you handle complex accounts." He watched her carefully. "Unless you'd prefer to start with something less challenging?" Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips. This was a test, and they both knew it. "I manage the accounts for a school of 300 students, Mr. Cooper. I doubt your ranch's books will prove beyond my capabilities." Something like approval flickered in his eyes. He handed her the ledger, then pulled a second chair around to his side of the desk. "Show me." For the next hour, Sarah lost herself in columns of numbers and farming terms. Cooper's presence beside her was both unnerving and oddly comfortable. He smelled of leather and coffee, and his occasional comments were precise and helpful rather than condescending. "You have a good head for this," he said finally, leaning back. "The position is yours if you want it. Full room and board, plus wages." He named a figure that made Sarah's eyes widen. "I believe in paying for quality work." "And you're not concerned about what the town will say? A single woman living in your home. The town can mind its own business." His tone was flat. "Your reputation will be protected. You'll have your own wing of the house. Complete privacy. The work is what matters here." Sarah studied him, trying to reconcile this man with the stories she'd heard in town. They called him a recluse, a hard man who drove sharp bargains. Yet here he was, offering her not just a position, but a chance at real independence. "There's one more thing," he said, standing. "Come with me." He led her through the house and out to the stables. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of hay and horses. Inside, a beautiful mare stood in one of the stalls, her coat gleaming chestnut in the filtered light. "This is Belle," Cooper said, approaching the horse. "She's gentle, but she's been refusing most riders lately." "I thought perhaps—" He trailed off, watching Sarah's reaction. Sarah stepped forward slowly, letting the mare catch her scent. Belle's ears pricked forward with interest. "Hello, beautiful," Sarah murmured, reaching up to stroke the horse's nose. Belle lowered her head, leaning into the touch. "Well now," Cooper said softly, "that's interesting." "My father raised horses," Sarah explained, still focused on Belle. "Not many, but he taught me their ways. They don't judge by appearances, only by how you treat them." "No, they don't." Cooper's voice held something new. "Respect, perhaps. Would you like to learn to ride her? Part of your duties would involve inspecting the far pastures. A horse of your own would be necessary." Sarah turned to him, startled. "My own horse? Belle needs a rider who understands her. You need a horse. It seems a fair match." He shrugged, but his eyes were keen on her face. "Unless you'd rather stick to bookkeeping." In that moment, Sarah saw the choice before her clearly. She could remain safe, stick to numbers and ledgers, hide herself away from judgment. Or she could embrace this chance. All of it, horses and hard work, and the opportunity to prove herself in ways Boston never allowed. "When do we start?" she asked. A rare smile crossed Cooper's face. "Tomorrow morning, first light. For now, let's get you settled in your rooms." He paused. "Welcome to Cooper Ranch, Ms. Matthews." As they walked back to the house, Sarah felt the weight of the past few days lifting. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she boarded that train in Boston. It was, perhaps, something better. A chance to be valued for her abilities rather than judged for her appearance. She thought of her journal, packed away in her trunk. Tonight she would have quite a story to write, but for now she had work to do, a house to learn, and a new life to begin. And somewhere in the stables, a chestnut mare waited to help her explore this vast new world that had opened before her. The ranch ledger lay open on Sarah's desk, its pages filled with her careful notations. 1 week at Cooper Ranch had taught her more than a lifetime in Boston. Her fingers traced the columns of figures, cattle counts, feed costs, wages for the ranch hands. Each number told a story of this vast operation. A knock at her office door drew her attention. "Come in." James Cooper entered, removing his hat. "How are the books coming along?" "I've found several discrepancies from the previous." "Bookkeeper." Sarah pulled out a separate sheet covered in her neat handwriting. "He was recording the same expenses twice in some places. I've started a complete audit." Cooper leaned over her shoulder to examine her work, and Sarah caught the now familiar scent of leather and morning air. "Good catch. That kind of attention to detail is exactly what I needed." He straightened up. "Ready for your riding lesson?" Sarah felt her heart leap. Every morning for the past week, before the sun fully crested the horizon, Cooper had taught her to ride Belle. The mare had proven as gentle as promised, responding to Sarah's touch with an eagerness that surprised even Cooper. "Just let me change into my riding skirt," Sarah said, standing. The divided skirt had been Cooper's first gift to her, practical, sturdy, and utterly scandalous by Boston standards. She loved it. Out in the stable yard, Belle nickered a greeting. Sarah approached with an apple saved from breakfast, letting the mare lip it from her palm. "Good morning, beautiful girl." "You've got away with her," Cooper observed, leading his own stallion from the stable. "She's calmer with you than I've ever seen her." Sarah mounted with growing confidence, adjusting her seat as Cooper had taught her. She just needed someone to understand her. Sometimes being different isn't a flaw, it's just being true to your nature. Cooper gave her a sharp look, but said nothing. They rode out together, the morning mist still clinging to the grass. Sarah had quickly learned that these rides served multiple purposes, teaching her horsemanship, showing her the ranch operations, and allowing Cooper to assess her capabilities. They passed a group of ranch hands moving cattle to fresh pasture. The men touched their hats respectfully to Cooper, and Sarah noted with satisfaction to her as well. She'd earned that respect over the past week, proving herself capable with both books and beasts. "Mr. Rodriguez," Cooper called out to his foreman, "how's that new herd settling in?" "Well enough, boss," Rodriguez replied, riding over. "Though that young stallion's still giving us trouble, won't let anyone near him." "The black one?" Sarah asked, remembering the magnificent horse she'd glimpsed in the far pasture. Rodriguez nodded. "He's got spirit, that one. Too much for his own good." "Sometimes spirit is exactly what's needed," Sarah said quietly, more to herself than the men. But Cooper heard her. "Would you like to see him?" he asked. They rode to the far pasture where the wild horses were kept. The black stallion stood apart from the herd, proud and wary. Sarah felt her breath catch at his beauty. "The men say he's unbreakable," Cooper told her, "too wild to tame." Sarah watched the horse, seeing something familiar in his stance. "Not unbreakable," she said. "Just unwilling to be something he's not. There's a difference." Cooper was silent for a long moment. "You understand that, don't you?" "Understanding comes from experience, Mr. Cooper." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Would you like to know what I've learned this week?" He nodded, curiosity evident in his expression. "I've learned that numbers don't lie, but they also don't tell. The whole truth, that horses judge you by your heart, not your appearance, that respect is earned through actions, not expectations." She smiled. "And that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as disappointments." A slow smile spread across Cooper's face. "You're full of surprises, Miss Matthews." They rode back to the ranch house in comfortable silence. The morning sun had burned away the mist, revealing the full scope of Cooper Ranch. Sarah saw it with new eyes now, not just as a refuge from humiliation, but as a place where she could truly belong. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat at her desk reviewing supply orders when she heard voices in the yard. A group of townswomen had arrived, no doubt curious about the scandal of her living at Cooper Ranch. She watched through her window as Cooper met them on the porch. "Mr. Cooper," she heard one say, "we're concerned about appearances. A single woman living here." "Mrs. Tate," Cooper's voice carried clearly. "Ms. Matthews is my employee. She manages my books, corresponds with my business partners, and is learning ranch operations. If you're concerned about appearances, I suggest you direct your attention to the improved efficiency of my operation since her arrival." The women withdrew, chastened, but not convinced. Sarah returned to her work, a warm glow of gratitude in her chest. Cooper hadn't defended her virtue or made excuses for her presence. He defended her competence, the one thing she knew she could rely on. That evening, as she made her final notes in the ledger, Sarah heard hoofbeats in the yard. Cooper had ridden out again, as he often did at sunset. She watched him go, this man who had given her not charity, but opportunity, not pity, but respect. In her journal that night, she wrote, "Dear Mama and Papa, I think I found something rare here, a place where I can be valued for who I am, rather than judged for who I'm not. Mr. Cooper is different from any man I've known. He sees people clearly, without the distorting lens of society's expectations. And the ranch, oh, the ranch is teaching me things about myself I never knew I needed to learn." She closed the journal and went to her window. The vast expanse of Cooper Ranch stretched out under the starlight, full of possibilities. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more challenges, more opportunities to prove herself. Sarah Matthews, once rejected as unmarriageable, had found something better than a hasty marriage. She had found purpose. The wild Mustang's bridle hung on the stable wall, its leather worn smooth with age. Sarah touched it gently as she waited for James to finish his morning inspection. Over the past month, this stable had become as familiar to her as her old Boston classroom. "Planning to try your hand at breaking horses?" James's voice carried a hint of amusement as he approached. "I was thinking about that black stallion," Sarah admitted. "He reminds me of someone I used to know." "Yourself?" James stepped closer, studying the bridle alongside her. "The girl I was in Boston, always trying to be smaller, quieter, more acceptable. She turned to face him. Do you know what finally? It broke her. James shook his head, his expression softening in the early morning light. Kindness. Not the condescending kind that comes with conditions, but real kindness. The kind that sees you clearly and accepts you anyway. She gestured around the stable. The kind I've found here. A moment of understanding passed between them, heavy with unspoken words. James cleared his throat. Speaking of kindness, Mrs. Rodriguez sent over some extra tamales. Would you care to join me for supper? It wasn't their first shared meal. Over the past weeks, their evening discussions had become a comfortable routine. They would review the day's business over coffee and whatever Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared, their conversations stretching long into the evening. I'd like that, Sarah said, but first I need to show you something in the ledgers. They walked together to her office, their steps falling naturally in sync. The ranch house had slowly transformed under Sarah's influence. Fresh flowers appeared. On tables, curtains were drawn back to let in light, and the dusty stillness had given way to an air of lived-in comfort. Sarah pulled out the latest accounts. We're losing money on the north pasture cattle. The grass there isn't sufficient for the herd size. But if we move them to the eastern section and use the north for hay production instead, James leaned over her shoulder, his presence warm and solid. You've studied the land usage patterns? I've been watching during our morning rides. The soil's better in the north, but the grazing's poor. It's basic economics combined with practical observation. A slow smile spread across James's face. You continue to surprise me, Ms. Matthews. Sarah, she said suddenly. After all this time, you might as well use my Christian name. Sarah, he repeated softly. Then you must call me James. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Sarah supervised the delivery of supplies while James met with his foreman about the proposed pasture changes. They worked in easy synchronization, each anticipating the other's needs. As evening approached, Sarah changed into a fresh dress for supper. She caught herself spending extra time with her hair, then laughed at her own foolishness. This wasn't a social calling. It was just another working meal with her employer. But when she entered the dining room, she found James had made an effort as well. His usual work clothes had been replaced with a clean shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed. The table was set with the good china, and a bottle of wine stood open to breathe. Mrs. Rodriguez outdid herself, James said, pulling out Sarah's chair. The tamales steamed on their plates, accompanied by fresh cornbread and honey. She's been very kind to me, Sarah said, settling into her seat. They all have. I never expected to find acceptance here. James poured the wine. I've learned that the best things in life often come unexpectedly. Their conversation flowed easily, moving from ranch business to personal histories. James spoke of his parents, of building the ranch from nothing, of long years of solitude. Didn't you ever consider marriage? Sarah asked, then immediately wished she could take back the too personal question. But James answered thoughtfully. I had offers. Daughters of wealthy ranchers, widows with their own property, but they all wanted the owner of Cooper Ranch, not James Cooper. He looked at her directly. I think you understand the difference. Sarah nodded, remembering Thomas Gardner's cruel dismissal. They see the position, not the person. Exactly. James reached for the wine bottle, his fingers brushing hers as she moved to help. Neither pulled away immediately. Tell me about Boston, he said softly. Tell me about the Sarah Matthews who left everything behind to come west. And so she did. She told him about her parents, about teaching, about the whispers and judgments that had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement. James listened, with quiet intensity, asking questions that showed he truly wanted to understand. You're a brave woman, he said when she finished, to leave everything familiar for an unknown future. Not brave, Sarah disagreed. Desperate, perhaps, but staying would have been braver than running away. You didn't run away, James said firmly. You ran toward something. There's a difference. He stood and walked to the window. Come look. At this, Sarah joined him. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant golds and purples. A herd of wild horses, including the black stallion, raced across the distant pasture. "Beautiful," Sarah breathed. "Yes," James agreed, but when she glanced up, he was looking at her, not the sunset. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then a door slammed somewhere in the house, breaking the spell. Sarah stepped back, her heart racing. "I should review tomorrow's correspondence," she said quickly. "Of course." James's voice was carefully neutral. "Thank you for joining me, Sarah." Later, in the privacy of her room, Sarah opened her journal. She stared at the blank page for a long time before writing, "Dear Mama and Papa, I'm beginning to understand what you meant about love being a choice as much as a feeling. Tonight I sat across from a man who sees me, truly sees me, and for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of being seen." She closed the journal and went to her window. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Somewhere in the darkness, wild horses ran free, and a man named James Cooper was perhaps looking at the same stars, thinking of a woman who had arrived on his doorstep as an employee and was becoming something more. Sarah touched her fingers to the glass, cool and solid beneath her touch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth and understanding, but tonight she allowed herself to dream of possibilities she had long ago stopped believing in. The gossipy town newspaper rustled in Sarah's hands as she read the latest Society Notes column over breakfast. Her name didn't appear directly, but the implications were clear. Certain wealthy ranchers would do well to remember their position in society when selecting household staff. Not all help is helpful to one's reputation. "Anything interesting?" James asked, entering the dining room. He'd taken to joining her for breakfast, claiming it was more efficient for discussing the day's business. Just the usual charming commentary from Mrs. Tate's poison pen. Sarah folded the paper with deliberate care. "Apparently, I'm destroying your reputation." James snorted as he poured his coffee. Mrs. Tate wouldn't know a good reputation if it introduced itself at church. He sat down across from her. "Speaking of town, I need to go in today. Supply orders to place. I'll come." "With you," Sarah said, straightening her spine. "The general store's accounts need reviewing, and I've been avoiding town long enough." James studied her over his coffee cup. "You don't have to prove anything to them." "No," she agreed, "but I have to prove something to myself." The ride into town was pleasant despite Sarah's nerves. Summer was fading into autumn, painting the grasslands in golds and russets. Belle matched her stride to James's stallion, the two horses as comfortable together as their riders had become. The first whispers started the moment they rode down Main Street. Sarah held her head high, remembering James's words about reputation. They tied their horses in front of the general store, and she was acutely aware of how it must look. The two of them arriving together, comfortable in each other's company. Inside, Thomas Gardner's face soured at their entrance. Mr. Cooper, Ms. Matthews, he practically choked on her name. "Good morning, Mr. Gardner," Sarah replied pleasantly. "I'm here to review your quarterly accounts with Cooper Ranch." She pulled out her ledger, every entry precise and professional. Gardner's face reddened. "Surely Mr. Cooper doesn't expect me to discuss business with my ranch manager," James cut in, his voice carrying through the store. "That's exactly what I expect, Gardner, unless you'd prefer to take your business elsewhere." The threat hung in the air. Everyone knew Cooper Ranch's business kept the general store afloat. Gardner swallowed his pride and pulled out his books. Sarah worked efficiently, pointing out discrepancies with calm authority. She was so focused on the task that she didn't notice Mrs. Tate and her sewing circle gathering outside until she heard their loud conversation through the open door. "Well, I never," Mrs. Tate's voice carried clearly. "Living alone with a man, riding around together. In my day, we knew what to call women like that." Sarah's hands stilled on the ledger. James took a step toward the door, but she caught his arm. "Don't. They're not worth it." "They're not fit to speak your name," he growled, but stayed beside her. The work completed, they stepped out onto the boardwalk. Mrs. Tate and her friends formed a gauntlet of disapproving faces. Sarah walked through them with her head high, James a solid presence at her side. "Mr. Cooper," Mrs. Tate called out sweetly, "we're concerned about your standing in the community. Surely you can find more appropriate help." James turned slowly. The look on his face made Mrs. Tate step back. "My standing in this community is built on hard work, fair dealing, and good judgment. Ms. Matthews exemplifies all three. I suggest you examine your own standing before questioning mine." He offered Sarah his arm, a clear statement to everyone watching. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked to their horses together, leaving shocked whispers in their wake. "That will only make the gossip worse," Sarah said as they mounted up. "Let them talk." James's voice was firm. "I meant what I said about good judgment. Hiring you was the best decision I've made in years." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. At the creek that marked the ranch's boundary, James reined his horse to a stop. "Sarah," his voice was different now, softer. "I need to say something." She turned Belle to face him, her heart suddenly racing. "What they're saying in town about us," he struggled with the words. "I don't want you to think I take it lightly. Your reputation, my reputation was in tatters the moment Thomas Gardner rejected me in public," Sarah interrupted. "At least now I'm being talked about for my own choices, not someone else's judgment." "Still," James ran a hand through his hair in frustration, "you deserve better than whispers and sidelong glances." Sarah studied him, this man who had given her a chance when everyone else saw only her flaws. "What I deserve is the opportunity to live my life on my own terms. You've given me that, James. The rest is just noise." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "You're an extraordinary woman, Sarah Matthews." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then a meadowlark called, breaking the spell, and they turned their horses toward home. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk, trying to focus on work. But her mind kept returning to the day's events. Not the petty cruelty of the townspeople, but the way James had stood beside her, proud and unashamed of their association. In her journal she wrote, "Dear Mama and Papa, today I learned something about courage. It's not about avoiding judgment or winning approval. It's about being true to yourself and standing beside those who see your worth. The town's disapproval means nothing compared to one person's unwavering support." She looked out her window at the starlit ranch. Somewhere out there, the wild black stallion ran free, answering to no one's expectations but his own. Sarah smiled, understanding now what James had seen in her that first day. Not someone to be tamed or changed, but someone whose true nature was finally being set free. The damaged barn door banged in the wind, a harsh counterpoint to the approaching storm. Sarah stood in the stable doorway, watching dark clouds mass over the mountains like an invading army. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity and unspoken words. "Storm's coming fast!" James's voice carried over the rising wind. "We need to get the horses in!" Sarah was already moving, racing toward the pasture where Belle and several other horses grazed. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs, but she'd long since learned to work despite such inconveniences. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as she reached the horses. "Easy, girl," she called to Belle, who trotted to her immediately. The other horses followed, sensing the approaching danger. Thunder cracked overhead as Sarah led them toward the barn. James appeared beside her, leading his stallion and two others. Their eyes met briefly in the strange stormlight, understanding passing between them without words. They worked in seamless coordination, securing the horses in their stalls just as the storm hit in earnest. The barn door, weakened by age and weather, gave way with a mighty crack. Rain and wind howled through the opening, spooking the horses. "Hold them!" James shouted, fighting with the door. Sarah moved down the line of stalls, speaking softly to each frightened animal. Belle's steady presence helped calm the others. Together, they managed to secure the door with rope and an old fence post. They stood for a moment, breathing hard, rain dripping from their clothes. Lightning illuminated the barn in harsh flashes, throwing James's face into sharp relief. "Are you all right?" he asked, reaching out to brush a wet strand of hair from her face. "Yes," Sarah whispered, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "The horses, they'll be fine." His hand lingered near her cheek. "Thanks to you. You've got a way with them that I've never seen before." Another crack of thunder made them both jump, breaking the moment. Sarah stepped back, her heart racing from more than just the storm. "We should check the other buildings," she said, turning toward the door. "Sarah," James's voice stopped her. She looked back to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. But whatever he was going to say was lost in a massive thunderclap. The horses whinnied in fear, and they both rushed to calm them. For the next hour, they worked together in the storm-darkened barn, moving between the stalls, speaking softly to the frightened animals. The worst of the storm passed eventually, leaving behind a gentle rain and charged silence. Sarah sat on a hay bale, exhausted, but content. James settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her damp clothes. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to hate storms like this. Too many hours alone in big, empty buildings, listening to the wind." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. "And now I'm not alone." He turned to look at her, his eyes soft in the lantern light. "Sarah, The dinner bell rang from the main house, startling them both. Mrs. Rodriguez would be worried. About them, they walked back to the house together through the gentle rain, shoulders brushing occasionally. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was full of possibilities, like the air after a storm. In her journal that night, Sarah wrote, "Dear Mama and Papa, today I learned that sometimes the most important things go unsaid, hanging in the air like lightning that hasn't struck. But you can feel them building, growing stronger with each passing moment. I wonder if this is how you felt in those early days when love was still unspoken, but as real as thunder in the distance." The hand-carved chess set caught the firelight as James set up the pieces. It had become their evening ritual. After the day's work was done and supper cleared away, they would sit before the fire and play. Sarah watched his hands move across the board, remembering how those same hands had nearly touched her face during the storm. "Your move," he said, settling back in his chair. The firelight softened his features, revealing the man beneath the ranch owner's stern exterior. Sarah studied the board, though her thoughts kept drifting to other matters. "Did you ever play chess with your father?" "He taught me." James moved a pawn, his fingers lingering on the carved wood. "Said it was good practice for running a ranch, thinking ahead, seeing all the possibilities." "And did it help?" Sarah captured his pawn, earning a rare smile. "With some things." He looked up at her. "Not everything can be planned like a chess game." The weight of unspoken words hung between them. Sarah focused on the board, trying to ignore how the firelight caught in his hair, how his presence filled the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. "Check," she said softly. James leaned forward to study the board, and Sarah caught the scent of leather and soap that had become so familiar. "Well played," he murmured. "You've learned quickly. I had a good teacher." Their eyes met across the board, and Sarah felt her breath catch. James cleared his throat. "Sarah, I've been meaning to ask—" A knock at the door interrupted him. Mrs. Rodriguez entered with coffee and her famous apple pie, her knowing smile suggesting she'd noticed the tension in the room. They ate in comfortable silence. The pie, sweet and warm, like the moment they were sharing. When James passed Sarah her coffee cup, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away immediately. "Tell me about your family," he said suddenly. "You speak of them often in the past tense, but with such love." Sarah set down her cup, touched by his interest. "They were good people, simple in their ways, but wise in their hearts. Papa always said that love was like breaking a wild horse. It took patience, trust, and the courage to hold on even when you're scared. He sounds like a wise man. James's voice was soft. I wish I could have met him. He would have liked you. Sarah surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. He valued honesty and hard work above all else, like you do. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, but here in this room, they had created their own small world of warmth and understanding. It's getting late, Sarah said finally, though she made no move to leave. Stay, James said quickly. Just a little longer, please. She nodded, unable to refuse the request she saw in his eyes. He reset the chessboard, but neither of them really focused on the game. Instead, they talked about books they'd read, dreams they'd had, the simple joys and sorrows that had shaped them. When Sarah finally rose to leave, James stood with her. They faced each other in the firelight, so much still unsaid between them. "Good night, James," she whispered. "Good night, Sarah." He took her hand, pressing it gently. "Sleep well." That night, Sarah's journal entry was brief. "Dear Mama and Papa, I understand now what you meant about love being in the small moments. A shared smile, a gentle touch, the way silence can feel like a conversation all its own. Tonight, I sat across from a man who makes me feel both perfectly at peace and wonderfully alive, and I realized that sometimes the greatest adventures aren't about going somewhere new, but about finding your way home." The blue ribbon gleamed against the dark wool of Sarah's best dress as she pinned it carefully in place. First prize for best preserves at the Copper Springs County Fair. A small victory, perhaps, but one that tasted as sweet as the strawberry jam that had won it. "You've caused quite a stir," James said, approaching her display table. His eyes shone with pride. "Mrs. Tate looks like she's swallowed one of your pickled onions." Sarah glanced across the fairground where Mrs. Tate and her circle stood whispering behind their fans. But there were others now, townspeople who had come to sample her preserves, to congratulate her, to ask about her methods. The same women who had once crossed the street to avoid her were now copying down her recipe for spiced peach preserves. "Your mother's recipe?" James asked softly, noticing how she touched the ribbon with almost reverent fingers. "Yes." Sarah smiled at the memory. "She always said the secret was patience, knowing exactly when the fruit was ready, waiting for just the right moment." "Like so many things in life," James replied, his voice carrying a deeper meaning. Before Sarah could respond, Reverend Mills approached with his wife. "Miss Matthews, these preserves are extraordinary. Would you consider making a batch for the church social?" "I'd be honored," Sarah said, noting how Mrs. Mills actually smiled at her. The first time since her arrival in Copper Springs. The fair bustled around them, a swirl of color and sound and autumn sunshine. Children ran past with candy apples, women compared quilts and pies, men gathered to discuss crops and cattle. Sarah felt something shift in the air. Not acceptance. Exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. "Miss Matthews," little Emma Thompson tugged at her skirt. "Will you help judge the pony show? Papa says you know all about horses now." Sarah glanced at James, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd love to." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Sarah found herself included in conversations, sought out for opinions, drawn into the fabric of community life. She judged ponies with Mr. Thompson, discussed preserving techniques with young wives, and even shared a pleasant word with Thomas Gardner's sister about the proper way to store root vegetables. "You've won them over," James murmured, as they walked through the fairground at sunset. "Not all of them, not yet, but enough to matter." "I didn't do it to win them over," Sarah replied. "I did it because it's who I am, who I've always been. When people bother to look past the surface." James stopped walking, turning to face her. The setting sun painted his features in gold, and Sarah's heart skipped at the intensity in his eyes. "I've always seen you, Sarah. From the first day." The moment stretched between them. heavy with possibility. Then the evening bell rang, calling everyone to the dance that would close the fair. Sarah felt James's hand brush hers, tentative but deliberate. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked formally, but his eyes danced with private meaning. "What will people say?" Sarah couldn't help asking, even as she placed her hand in his. "They'll say James Cooper knows quality when he sees it." He led her toward the dance floor. "In preserves and in people." That night, Sarah added another entry to her journal. "Dear Mama and Papa, today I won a blue ribbon, but that wasn't the real prize. The real victory was in standing tall, in being myself without apology, in seeing respect replace rejection in the eyes of those who once shunned me. But most of all, it was in dancing with a man who has never asked me to be anything but exactly who I am. Your recipe won the prize, Mama, but your lessons about patience and self-worth won me something far more precious: the beginning of belonging." The threatening letter lay on Sarah's desk like a coiled snake. The elegant handwriting couldn't disguise the venom beneath its polite phrases. It would be a shame if Mr. Cooper's reputation suffered due to unfortunate associations. Perhaps it's time to consider more suitable arrangements. Sarah's hands trembled as she folded the unsigned note. She'd noticed the changes in town since the fair, the subtle shift in attitudes, the growing acceptance. But this letter proved not everyone approved of her rising status at Cooper Ranch. "Sarah?" James stood in the doorway, his expression darkening as he caught sight of her face. "What's wrong?" Before she could answer, hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Through her window, Sarah saw a handsome carriage pull up, drawn by a matched pair of greys. A well-dressed man stepped down, his bearing speaking of old money and Eastern refinement. "Maxwell Thornton," James muttered. "What's he doing here?" Sarah had heard the name, a wealthy rancher from the next county, known for his political ambitions and carefully cultivated connections. His arrival at Cooper Ranch couldn't be coincidence. "James!" Thornton's voice carried through the open window, artificially jovial. "I've come to discuss that breeding program we talked about, and to meet this remarkable woman I've heard so much about." James's jaw tightened, but social conventions had to be observed. Introductions were made in the parlor, where Thornton's calculating gaze swept over Sarah with uncomfortable thoroughness. "Charming," he said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I can see why James has been keeping you all to himself. But surely a woman of your capabilities deserves a more suitable position." "I find my current position entirely suitable," Sarah replied coolly. Of course," Thornton waved his hand dismissively. "But there are other opportunities. My ranch, for instance, could use someone with your business acumen, in a proper professional capacity." Naturally, the emphasis he placed on proper made its meaning clear. James stepped forward, but Sarah touched his arm gently, holding him back. "Mr. Thornton," she said clearly, "are you offering me employment or delivering a message?" His smile slipped slightly. "Let's call it friendly advice. There are certain people in town who are concerned about proprieties, people whose good opinion James might need, especially with the railroad contract coming up for negotiation." "I see." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "And these concerned citizens sent you to convey their worries. They merely suggested that someone of my standing might be able to offer a solution that benefits everyone." He turned to James. "No one wants a scandal, especially not with the railroad board being so particular about their business partners." The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. James's face had gone hard as granite. "I think you should leave, Maxwell." "Think about it, Cooper." Thornton rose smoothly. "Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." His eyes lingered on Sarah. "Though some sacrifices are more pleasant than others." After he left, James paced the parlor like a caged lion. "I'll not be blackmailed, especially not by the likes of Maxwell Thornton." "The railroad contract," Sarah said quietly. "It's important to the ranch, isn't it?" "Not as important as—" He stopped abruptly, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Sarah pulled out the anonymous letter, showing it to him. Won't stop, will they? No. James took the letter, his fingers brushing hers. But we won't stop either. Whatever game Thornton and his friends are playing, we'll face it together. The word together hung between them, full of meaning. Sarah thought of her journal entry that night. Dear Mama and Papa, today I learned that happiness comes with a price, but I also learned that some things are worth fighting for, even when the whole world seems aligned against them. James stood beside me today, choosing what was right over what was easy. How can I do any less? The sabotaged saddle lay in the dust, its cut-girth strap a mute testimony to deliberate malice. Sarah stared at it, still shaking from her near fall. If James hadn't noticed something wrong with Belle's gait, if he hadn't called out for her. To stop! Easy, James murmured, his arms still around her waist where he'd caught her as she slipped sideways. You're safe now. Belle stood nearby, trembling but unhurt. The mare had responded instantly to Sarah's commands, staying calm even as the saddle slipped. But someone had meant for this ride to end very differently. Who would do this? Sarah whispered, though she already knew. The threatening letter, Thornton's visit, and now this. The escalation was clear. James knelt to examine the strap, his face dark with fury. Clean cut, hidden under the fleece lining. This wasn't random mischief. He stood, still holding the saddle. They crossed a line, moving from threats to actual harm. The railroad. Contract? Damn the contract! James's explosion of anger startled them both. He took a breath, visibly controlling himself. Sarah, if anything had happened to you, but it didn't. She touched his arm gently. Thanks to you. A sound made them both turn. Thomas Gardner stood at the stable entrance, his face pale. I didn't mean... He swallowed hard. It wasn't supposed to go this far. What do you know about this? James's voice was deadly quiet. Thornton said, he said we'd just scare her off. Make her leave on her own. Gardner's words tumbled out. He promised if we got rid of her, he'd make sure the railroad board looked favorably on local businesses. Said having her here was ruining the town's reputation. So, you tried to kill her? James took a step forward, but Sarah held him back. No, I just told them about her morning rides, about which saddle she uses. I didn't know they'd... Gardner looked sick. When I heard what they planned, I came to warn you, but I was too late. Who's they? Sarah asked quietly. Thornton's men. He's been working with some of the town council members. They want control of the railroad contract, want to force you to sell part of the ranch. Gardner turned to James. They've been planning this for months, even before she came. Her presence just gave them an excuse. James's expression hardened. Names. I want every name. As Gardner talked, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. This wasn't about her, not really. She was just a convenient target in a larger scheme. The realization should have hurt, but instead it made her angry. We'll need proof, she said. When Gardner finished, both men turned to look at her. If we're going to stop them, we need more than just his word. James studied her face. You're staying, even after this? I'm through running from other people's schemes and judgments. She met his gaze steadily. Unless you want me to go. No, he said roughly. Never. Gardner cleared his throat awkwardly. I have letters. From Thornton. From the others. I kept them, just in case. Bring them, James ordered. And Gardner, if anything else happens to her, there won't be a hole deep enough for you to hide in. After Gardner left, Sarah and James stood in the stable's dim light, the damaged saddle. Between them, like a bridge both connecting and separating them. I should have protected you better, James said softly. You did protect me. You saw the danger in time. Sarah touched the saddle's cut strap. And now we know who our real enemies are. We? His voice held a question. Yes, we, she smiled, slightly. They wanted to frighten me away from you. They failed. In her journal that night, Sarah wrote, Dear Mama and Papa, today I faced death and found strength, not just in myself, but in the way James and I stood together against those who would harm us. Love, I'm learning, isn't just about gentle moments by the fire. Sometimes it's about choosing to stay and fight, side by side, against whatever comes. The love letter rested in James's pocket, its weight as heavy as the words it contained. He'd written and rewritten it a dozen times during the sleepless night after the sabotage attempt, each version trying to capture what had become blindingly clear in that moment of near tragedy. He couldn't lose her. Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing contracts as if it were any ordinary day, as if she hadn't nearly been killed yesterday. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the auburn highlights in her hair, and James felt the words he'd so carefully written dissolve in his throat. "Sarah." His voice came out rougher than intended. She looked up, and something in his expression made her set down her pen. "James? What is it?" He crossed to her desk, taking out the letter only to set it aside. Written words wouldn't do. Not for this. "Yesterday, when I saw that saddle strap, when I thought about what could have happened, but it didn't happen," she said softly. "No, it didn't, but it made me realize something I should have said weeks ago." He took her hands, helping her to her feet. "Sarah Matthews, I love you." Her eyes widened, but he pressed on before courage failed him. "I love your strength, your dignity, your quiet way of proving everyone wrong. I love how you talk to horses and write in your journal and refuse to be anything less than who you are." "James." Tears gleamed in her eyes. "I know it won't be easy. The town, Thornton, the railroad, we'll face challenges, but I don't want to face them with anyone else." He touched her cheek gently. "I don't want anyone else." Sarah leaned into his touch, but he felt her trembling. "Are you sure?" I'm not what people expect for the owner of Cooper Ranch." "You're exactly what I want for the owner of Cooper Ranch." He smiled slightly. "Or rather, the co-owner, if you'll have me." She pulled back slightly, searching his face. "James Cooper, are you proposing to me?" "Badly, it seems." He reached for the letter, but her hand stopped him. "No!" Her voice was firm. "If you're asking, ask me properly. No letters, no contracts, no business arrangements. Just truth." James took both her hands in his, understanding what she needed. No hiding behind paper or propriety. Just two hearts, finally honest with each other. "I love you, Sarah. Not as my bookkeeper or my ranch manager, but as the woman who brought life back to this house and hope back to my heart. Will you marry me? Will you make this ranch our home, face whatever comes together, build a life with me?" For a moment that felt eternal, Sarah was silent. Then she smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Yes. Yes to all of it." He pulled her close, finally allowing himself to hold her the way he'd wanted to for so long. When their lips met, it felt like coming home and starting an adventure all at once. "They'll fight us," Sarah whispered against his shoulder. "Thornton and his allies won't give up easily. Let them try." James stroked her hair. "We'll face them together." And Sarah, he pulled back to look at her. "I'm proud to have you by my side. Never doubt that." She touched his face gently. "I used to dream of someone looking at me the way you do, like I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be. You are." He caught her hand, kissing her palm. "You're the woman I love, and soon you'll be my wife. Everything else is just details." That evening, Sarah's journal entry was brief but radiant. "Dear Mama and Papa, today I learned that love doesn't ask you to be smaller or different or less. Real love expands to encompass all that you are, all that you might become. James loves me not in spite of who I am, but because of it. You always said I'd find my place in the world. You were right. I just had to be brave enough to claim it." The sheriff's report lay open on the town council table, its official language spelling out the conspiracy in black and white. Attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted blackmail. The charges formed a damning litany against Maxwell, Thornton and his conspirators. The town hall was packed, every bench filled with spectators eager to witness the confrontation. Sarah stood beside James at the front, her head high despite the whispers. The evidence Gardner had provided was irrefutable. Letters, contracts, detailed plans to force James to sell controlling interest in Cooper Ranch. Thornton sat with his lawyers, his usual polish showing signs of wear. When James stepped forward to address the council, the room fell silent. "Members of the council," James's voice carried clearly, "you have before you evidence of a conspiracy that goes beyond mere business rivalry. These men didn't just try to force a sale, they attempted to murder an innocent woman to achieve their goals." "Alleged attempted murder," Thornton's lawyer interrupted. "My client had no knowledge of any sabotage." "Tell that to the ranch hand, who confessed to cutting the saddle strap on your orders," James countered. "Tell that to Thomas Gardner, who's provided a full statement about your plans." Sarah watched the council members' faces. Some showed shock, others guilt. A few, she noted, couldn't meet her eyes at all. "Even if these allegations are true," Mrs. Tate spoke from her council seat, "we must consider the broader implications. The railroad contract will go to whoever can best serve the territory's interests," a new voice interrupted. "The railroad." Commissioner stood up from the back of the room. "And I can assure you, attempted murder does not serve those interests." A murmur ran through the crowd. The commissioner hadn't been expected until next week. His early arrival and his hearing of everything changed the dynamics completely. "Furthermore," the commissioner continued, "I find it interesting that Mr. Thornton promised influence with the railroad board that he doesn't possess. We choose our business partners based on character and capability." He nodded to James and Sarah. "From what I've observed, Cooper Ranch has both in abundance." Thornton's face had gone pale. "This is absurd. You can't possibly consider giving the contract to a man who what?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "Who judges people by their character rather than their appearance? Who values honest work over social standing? Who stands against corruption even when it costs him?" The room stilled at her words. She continued, "You tried to drive me away because you thought I was James's weakness. But love isn't weakness. Standing together against injustice isn't weakness. The only weakness here is in those who would resort to violence and fraud to get their way." James took her hand publicly, a gesture that would have caused scandal weeks ago, but now drew murmurs of approval. "The choice is yours," he told the council. "But know this, Sarah Matthews will soon be Sarah Cooper, co-owner of Cooper Ranch. Anyone who wants to do business with us will respect that, or they won't do business with us at all." The council chamber erupted in conversation. The sheriff moved to take Thornton into custody as his lawyers protested, but Sarah hardly noticed. She was watching the faces in the crowd, seeing the shift as people chose sides, not between power and weakness now, but between right and wrong. Mrs. Henderson was the first to approach them. "About time," she said, hugging Sarah. "I've been planning this wedding in my head for months." Others followed, first a few, then a steady stream of townspeople offering congratulations, apologies, support. Not everyone, not yet, but enough to mark a true change. That night's journal entry captured the triumph. "Dear Mama and Papa, today we stood against those who thought love could be defeated by fear, truth by lies, courage by corruption. We won not just because we were right, but because we stood together, unashamed and unafraid. The town had to choose between love and fear today. Love won." The wedding dress pattern spread across Sarah's bed, its tissue paper pieces promising elegance without ostentation. Mrs. Henderson and a circle of town ladies hovered over it, discussing alterations with the same serious attention they might give a diplomatic treaty. "The neckline should be higher," Mrs. Tate suggested, her former opposition transformed into almost aggressive support, "to show dignity." "But the waist needs fullness," Mrs. Rodriguez countered, winking at Sarah. "For dancing at the reception." Sarah watched them with quiet amusement, remembering how these same women had once crossed the street to avoid her. Now they filled her room with chatter and wedding plans, their acceptance as natural as if it had always been there. "Have you seen the guest list?" Mrs. Henderson whispered to her. "Half the territory's planning to come. They're calling it the social event of the year." "They're calling it more than that," Sarah replied softly. "They're calling it a victory." And it was, in its way. A victory not just for her and James, but for everyone who'd ever been judged by appearance rather than character. The story had spread. The mail-order bride rejected for her size, who had helped expose a conspiracy, win a railroad contract, and capture the heart of the territory's most eligible rancher. "Sarah?" James's voice carried up from the yard. Can you come down for a moment?" She excused herself from the sewing circle and descended to find James with the wild black stallion they'd watched months ago. The horse was still untamed, but now he stood quietly beside James, something like trust in his dark eyes. "I thought," James said, smiling, "he might like to meet the woman who understood him first." Sarah approached slowly, letting the stallion catch her scent. He reminded her of herself in those early days, proud, wary, unwilling to be anything but what he was. When he lowered his head to her hand, she felt tears prick her eyes. He just needed someone to see him properly, she said. "Like someone else I know." James wrapped his arms around her from behind, no longer caring who might see. "The railroad commissioner wants to expand the contract. Says he's never seen better managed books." "Is that why you love me? My bookkeeping skills?" "I love you because you're you." He turned her to face him. "The books are just a bonus." Their laughter carried up to the window, where the sewing circle watched, prompting smiles and knowing looks. The town had changed, but so had they. James had learned to show his heart openly, and Sarah had learned that being true to yourself sometimes meant letting others see your joy. That evening, after the wedding planners had departed, Sarah walked through the ranch house, her future home. The rooms seemed to welcome her, the spaces between the fine furniture and family portraits, waiting to be filled with new memories. She found James in his study, reviewing contracts. No, their study now. He looked up as she entered, his face softening in that way that still made her heart skip. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, only half joking. "About the wedding?" "No." She perched on the edge of his desk. "About letting Mrs. Tate design my wedding dress? Possibly." He laughed, pulling her into his lap. "You could wear a potato sack and still be the most beautiful bride in the territory. You're biased." "Completely." He kissed her softly, and proud of it. That night's journal entry reflected her contentment. "Dear Mama and Papa, today I watched a town transform. A wild horse learn trust, and a love grow stronger with each passing hour. The wedding plans are grand, but the real celebration isn't about dresses or guest lists. It's about the victory of truth over prejudice, of love over fear, of being who you are and finding someone who loves you for exactly that. You always said, happiness comes to those who wait for the right person. You were wrong about one thing. Though sometimes happiness comes to those who are brave enough to become the right person for themselves first." The marriage certificate waited on Reverend Mills's desk, its blank lines ready to record a moment that would change not just two lives, but an entire community. Outside the church, it seemed all of Copper Springs had gathered, dressed in their finest, waiting to witness what many now called their favorite love story. Sarah stood in the church's back room, smoothing her wedding dress with trembling hands. The seamstresses had outdone themselves, creating a gown that celebrated rather than concealed her figure. Delicate lace traced patterns across the bodice, and the full skirt moved like water when she walked. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Henderson said, adjusting Sarah's veil. "James won't know what hit him." "Neither will the town," Mrs. Rodriguez added with a grin. "Remember how they used to talk? Now look, the church is packed with people calling you our Sarah." Sarah touched the locket at her throat, her mother's, containing tiny portraits of her parents. "I wish they could see this." "They can," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "Love like this reaches beyond any divide." The church bells began to ring, and Sarah's heart soared. Through the door, she could hear the murmur of guests settling, the soft notes of the organ beginning. This wasn't the wedding she'd dreamed of as a girl, planning to be a demure bride in Boston. This was better. This was real. The doors opened, and Sarah caught her first glimpse of James waiting at the altar. He stood tall and proud in his best suit, but it was his face that caught her heart, the look of pure joy and love as he saw her. Walking down the aisle, Sarah felt the warmth of the community's acceptance. These people had watched their story unfold, had seen love triumph over prejudice, had learned that true beauty came in many forms. Even Mrs. Tate was crying happy tears. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mills began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness not just a marriage, but a testament to the power of love to transform hearts and minds." The traditional words followed, but Sarah barely heard them. She was lost in James's eyes, in the gentle strength of his hands holding hers, in the future that stretched before them like the endless prairie. "I, James Cooper, take you, Sarah Matthews, to be my lawfully wedded wife." His voice was steady but full of emotion. "I promise to love you exactly as you are, to stand beside you against any storm, to build our dreams together, and to thank God every day for bringing you to my door." Sarah's voice trembled only slightly as she made her own vows. "I, Sarah Matthews, take you, James Cooper, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you with all the strength you saw in me before I saw it myself, to face whatever comes by your side, to fill our home with joy, and to remember always that love sees with the heart." The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit, just like them. When Reverend Mills pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers. James's kiss was tender and proud, a public declaration of private joy. At the reception, the ranch house glowed with lanterns and laughter. The wild black stallion, now gentled, stood in a nearby paddock with Belle, as if observing the celebration. Couples danced on the lawn, children played between the tables, and former enemies shared slices of wedding cake. "Happy, Mrs. Cooper?" James whispered as they swayed to the music. "More than I knew was possible," Sarah replied, resting her head on his shoulder. That night, before leaving for their honeymoon, Sarah made one final entry in her old journal. "Dear Mama and Papa, today I became not just a wife, but a symbol of hope for anyone who's ever felt different. James and I didn't just get married. We proved that love is stronger than prejudice, that worth isn't measured by appearance, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories come from daring to be exactly who you are." The family portrait hung proudly in the ranch house parlor, capturing a moment of perfect happiness. Sarah and James Cooper sat together, her hand resting on her growing belly, their faces glowing with anticipation of their first child. Behind them stood the evidence of their successful year, the railroad contract framed on one wall, the blue ribbon from the county fair on another, and through the window, the now gentle black stallion grazing peacefully beside Belle. "Another letter from the Women's Society," James said, handing Sarah the morning mail. They still took breakfast together every morning, now as equals in all things. "They want you to speak at their conference about ranch management." Sarah smiled, remembering how those same society women had once shunned her. Now they sought her advice, not just on business matters, but on finding the courage to be themselves. "Life has a way of surprising you," she said, touching the journal that still sat on her desk. Its pages held the story of their love, a testament to the power of seeing beyond surfaces to the heart beneath. James knelt beside her chair, his hand joining hers over their unborn child. "Not so surprising," he said softly. "I knew from that first day that you were exactly what this ranch needed. What I needed." Through the window, they could see copper. Springs growing, prospering under the railroad's influence. But more importantly, they could see it changing, becoming a place where people were judged by their character rather than their appearance. "We did that," Sarah said proudly. "Together." James kissed her gently. "Together," he agreed. "Always."